I never believed in ghosts until I worked the night shift at Mercy General Hospital. That was 3 years ago, and I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about what I witnessed in Ward 7. I'm telling you this story not because I want to, but because I need to. Because what happened to me could happen to anyone, and maybe if I warn you, you'll make better choices than I did. I was fresh out of nursing school, desperate for experience and drowning in student loans. The graveyard shift at Mercy General paid 30% more than day shifts, and nobody else seemed to want it. I figured, how hard could it be? Most patients would be sleeping, right? I'd catch up on paperwork, maybe even study for my certification exams. I should have asked why nobody else wanted that job. Mercy General was built in 1923, a massive brick structure that squatted on the edge of downtown like a sleeping giant. Ward 7 housed the terminal patients, the long-term care wing where families brought their loved ones to die with dignity. The hallway stretched what felt like forever under flickering fluorescent lights that hummed constantly, creating this low, almost subliminal buzz that got into your bones after a few hours. Even during the day, shadows seemed to pool in corners that the light never quite reached. The linoleum floor was so old it had developed a pattern of scuff marks and stains that looked almost deliberate, like some kind of map or message that only became visible when you stared at it long enough during those long, quiet hours. My supervisor, Margaret, was a woman in her 60s who'd been working nights at Mercy for over 30 years. She had this way of looking at you like she could see straight through to your soul, and when she showed me around that first night, I noticed she moved through Ward 7 differently than the other wings. Faster. More purposeful. Like she didn't want to linger. The patients here are mostly peaceful, she told me as we walked past room after room of sleeping forms. Pain management is your priority. Many of them are on morphine drips, so you'll see some confusion, some talking to people who aren't there. Just go with it. Don't argue with them about what they're seeing. At the time, I thought she was just talking about standard drug-induced hallucinations. My first few weeks were relatively uneventful. I'd make my rounds every 2 hours, check vitals, dispense medication, update charts. The patients were mostly elderly, many with advanced dementia or in various stages of unconsciousness. Some had families who visited during regular hours, leaving behind personal items and photographs that created these little shrines of memory around each bed. Room 714 had been empty since before I started, something about maintenance issues that were never quite specified. When I asked Margaret about it, she got this look on her face, like she was choosing her words very carefully. Plumbing problems, she said finally. Been going on for months. Administration keeps saying they'll fix it, but... She shrugged and walked away, leaving the sentence hanging in the air like smoke. It was mid-October when Mrs. Chen in room 712 started talking about the visitors. Mrs. Chen was 93, a tiny bird of a woman with pancreatic cancer that had metastasized throughout her body. She was sharp as a tack mentally, despite the pain medication, which is why what she told me was so unsettling. They come at night, she whispered during my 2 a.m. round, her arthritic fingers gripping my wrist with surprising strength. The sad ones. They stand at the foot of my bed and just watch. I checked her chart. Her morphine levels were well within normal ranges, but I made a note to mention the hallucinations to the day nurse anyway. What did they look like, Mrs. Chen? I asked gently, trying to keep my voice professional and soothing. Like patients, she said. Hospital gowns, you know? But old-fashioned ones. And their faces. She shuddered. So sad. Like they're carrying all the sorrow in the world. I patted her hand and adjusted her pillow, making comforting sounds. But something about the specificity of her description bothered me. Usually, morphine hallucinations were more abstract, flashing lights, moving shadows, voices without sources. Mrs. Chen was describing actual people with specific clothing and expressions. Then Mr. Rodriguez in 710 mentioned the same thing 3 nights later. And Mrs. Patterson in 715 the night after that. Always the same description, figures in hospital gowns standing silently at the foot of their beds, just watching with expressions of profound sadness. I started keeping notes, unofficial ones in my personal notebook. Patient names, times, descriptions. A pattern was emerging, but I wasn't ready to acknowledge what it might mean. The first time I saw one myself was a Tuesday night in November. The autumn wind was howling outside, rattling the old windows and making the heating system work overtime with groans and clanks that echoed through the empty corridors. I was updating charts at the nurse's station, the only sound the scratch of my pen and that eternal fluorescent buzz, when movement caught my eye. Down the hall, near room 714, the empty room, a figure in a hospital gown stood motionless in the doorway. My heart jumped. Patients weren't supposed to be wandering alone, especially not the ones in this ward. Most of them couldn't even get out of bed without assistance. "Sir?" I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the empty hallway. "Sir, you need to get back to bed." The figure didn't respond. Didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. As I stood up from the desk, my chair creaking loudly in the silence, I realized something was wrong. The person was too still, unnaturally so. No rise and fall of breathing, no slight movements that living bodies make unconsciously, the tiny shifts in weight, the occasional twitch or adjustment that even sleeping people do. I grabbed a flashlight from the supply drawer and started walking down the hall, my rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the linoleum. Each step seemed to echo longer than it should, and I became hyper-aware of every sound, the distant hum of machinery, the whisper of air through the ventilation system, the faint tick of the clock on the wall. When I got within 10 feet of the figure, it turned to look at me. I'll never forget that face. It was gaunt, hollow-eyed, with skin that seemed almost translucent in the dim lighting. The bone structure was sharp, angular, like someone who had lost a tremendous amount of weight very quickly. But it was the expression that froze my blood, not malevolent, not angry, not even particularly interested in me as a person. Just infinitely, unbearably sad. The eyes were the worst part. Dark, deep-set, and filled with what I can only describe as the weight of accumulated grief. Like this person had witnessed every tragedy, every loss, every moment of suffering that had ever occurred in this place, and was carrying all of it at once. I blinked, one of those reflexive, involuntary blinks you do when your brain can't process what you're seeing, and the figure was gone. Just gone. No movement, no fading, no dramatic disappearance. One moment it was there, solid and real as anything, and the next moment it wasn't. I stood in that hallway for a full 5 minutes, shining my flashlight into the empty doorway of room 714, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. The room was completely bare, no bed, no furniture, just empty space with exposed pipes along one wall where they'd apparently been doing the mysterious plumbing work. But I knew what I had seen. And more importantly, I knew it had seen me. I told myself it was exhaustion, stress from the new job, maybe even some kind of optical illusion created by the interplay of shadows and fluorescent light. But deep down, in that primitive part of the brain that still remembers when humans were prey animals, I knew what I'd encountered. The next night, I started paying closer attention to the patient's complaints about visitors. I began asking follow-up questions, documenting their descriptions more carefully. The consistency was remarkable and deeply disturbing. They all described the same thing: people in hospital gowns, always hospital gowns, standing silently at the foot of their beds or in doorways, watching with eyes full of grief. The visitors never spoke, never moved closer, never made any attempt to communicate. They just observed, as if waiting for something, or bearing witness to something. Mrs. Chen was the most articulate about her experiences, probably because her mind was still sharp despite her failing body. "There's one woman who comes most often," she told me during a particularly difficult night when her pain was severe. "Young, maybe 25 or 30. She has dark hair pulled back, and her gown has these little blue flowers on it. Old-fashioned pattern, you know? Like from the 50s or something." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Does she ever try to talk to you?" "No, never. She just stands there and looks at me with such sadness. Like she wants to help but can't. Sometimes I think she's trying to tell me something, but..." Mrs. Chen's voice trailed off as another wave of pain hit her. That's when I decided to research the hospital's history. If there was a rational explanation for what we were all experiencing, some kind of mass hallucination, environmental factors, something in the water or air, I was going to find it. What I discovered made my skin crawl. I spent my lunch breaks in the hospital's administrative offices, going through old records and files. The librarian, a helpful woman named Susan, directed me to boxes of archived documents that hadn't been digitized yet. Most of it was routine stuff: budget reports, staff memos, maintenance records, but buried in a box labeled 1950s incidents I found what I was looking for. On March 15, 1952, there had been a fire in the original Ward 7. It started in the early morning hours, around 3 a.m., in what was then the supply closet. The cause was listed as electrical malfunction in heating unit. The fire spread quickly through the old wooden interior walls, and the sprinkler system, newly installed and apparently defective, failed to activate. 14 patients died that night. 14 people trapped in their beds, unable to escape, while smoke and flames consumed the ward around them. The incident report made for grim reading, detailed descriptions of which rooms were affected, which patients were rescued, which ones weren't found until after the fire was extinguished. But it was the survivor interviews that really got to me. The ward was rebuilt within a year, with modern fire safety systems and all-metal construction. But hospital records from the decades following showed an unusual pattern. Patients in the new Ward 7 consistently reported the same phenomenon: silent watchers in hospital gowns appearing in their rooms during the night hours. These reports went back decades. Different nurses, different administrators, different patients, but always the same basic description. The hospital's response had evolved over the years from taking the reports seriously in the 1950s and 60s, to dismissing them as drug-induced hallucinations by the 1980s and 90s, to the current policy of not officially acknowledging them at all. But they never stopped happening. The breakthrough came when I found an old newspaper clipping from 1953, tucked between pages of a maintenance log. It was from the local paper, a follow-up story on the fire's anniversary. The headline read, "Fire Survivor Still Haunted by Tragedy." It featured an interview with Dorothy Mills, an elderly woman who had been one of only 3 patients rescued from Ward 7 that night. She described how, in her final moments before the firefighters reached her, she had seen the spirits of the patients who didn't make it out. They were standing by the windows, the article quoted her as saying, looking back into the burning ward with such sadness. It was like they couldn't leave, you know? Like they were waiting for something, or someone. I'll never forget their faces. So much sorrow. Mrs. Mills went on to describe how she continued to see them even after being moved to a different wing of the hospital. "They visit me sometimes," she said. "Just standing there, watching. I don't think they mean any harm. I think they're just lost." That's when I understood. The visitors weren't malevolent spirits seeking revenge or trying to frighten people. They were the souls of those 14 patients, still trapped in Ward 7, still bound to the place where they had died. They had become eternal witnesses to the final moments of others, unable to move on, held by some cosmic responsibility to comfort those making the transition between life and death. The realization should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Because I began to notice something else: the visitors were becoming more frequent, more solid, more present. And they were no longer content to simply watch from the foot of beds. 3 weeks ago, I was checking on Mr. Hendricks in room 708 when I saw her clearly, the young woman Mrs. Chen had described, with dark hair and a hospital gown covered in small blue flowers. She was standing directly beside his bed, not at the foot like the others usually did. Her hand was reaching toward his forehead, hovering just inches above his skin, almost touching but not quite. Mr. Hendricks was unconscious, his breathing labored and irregular. The cancer had spread to his lungs, and we all knew he didn't have much time left. But seeing that figure reaching for him, I felt compelled to step forward. "Don't," I whispered, though I'm not sure why. She looked at me with those impossibly sad eyes, and I swear I heard a whisper, barely audible, "Soon." Mr. Hendricks died 2 hours later. Peaceful, quiet, just slipped away. Now they appear every night, more solid each time, more interactive. Last week, I counted 7 of them in the hallway, standing in a loose group near the empty room 714. They looked at me as I passed, and I could feel their attention like a physical weight. They're not content to simply observe anymore. They're actively participating, guiding souls across whatever threshold exists between life and death. And every time someone passes away on my shift, I see them gather around the room afterward, like they're welcoming the newly departed into their eternal vigil. But here's what truly terrifies me. Yesterday morning, as I was finishing my shift and washing up in the staff bathroom, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror above the sink. For just a moment, maybe it was the fluorescent lighting, maybe it was exhaustion from another sleepless night, my eyes looked exactly like theirs. That same infinite sadness, that same patient waiting, that same burden of accumulated grief. I've put in my transfer request to the day shift in the pediatric ward. Something bright and hopeful, full of life and recovery stories. But I'm starting to wonder if it's too late. Because I think I understand now what they've been waiting for all these years. They've been waiting for someone to join them. Someone to help carry the weight of all that sorrow, all those final moments, all that accumulated grief from decades of watching people die. And I think they've chosen me. I finish my last shift tomorrow night. Margaret seemed relieved when I told her about the transfer, like she'd been expecting it. Ward 7 isn't for everyone, she said, and there was something in her voice that made me think she understood more than she was letting on. If you're reading this, and I don't show up for my new position on Monday morning, you'll know the restless souls of Ward 7 finally found what they were looking for. Sometimes, the living are chosen to serve the dead. And sometimes, we don't get a choice in the matter. This account was found in the personal effects of Sarah Martinez, RN, who disappeared on November 30th after completing her final night shift in Ward 7 at Mercy General Hospital. Security footage shows her entering the hospital that night, but no record exists of her leaving. Room 714 has remained empty since her disappearance, though several patients have reported seeing a young woman in scrubs standing in the doorway, watching them with sad, understanding eyes. I'm writing this because I need someone to know what really happened at the Riverside Cemetery. My name is David Chen, and until 6 months ago, I was the night groundskeeper there. I held the job for 8 years, and in all that time, I thought I'd seen everything a cemetery could throw at you. Vandals, grieving families sneaking in after hours, even the occasional homeless person looking for shelter. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I discovered during those final weeks. You have to understand, working nights in a cemetery isn't as creepy as people think. After the first few months, it becomes routine. You do your rounds, check the gates, make sure the sprinkler systems are working properly. Most nights are peaceful, almost meditative. The dead don't cause problems, it's the living you have to worry about. Riverside Cemetery has been around since 1887, sprawling across 43 acres of rolling hills on the outskirts of town. During the day, it's actually quite beautiful, with its ancient oak trees and carefully maintained gardens. At night, with proper lighting along all the main paths, it's just another workplace. I have my little office in the maintenance building, complete with security monitors, a coffee maker, and a comfortable chair where I could read between rounds. The cemetery is divided into several sections: the original grounds from the 1800s with their elaborate Victorian monuments, the military section with rows of identical white headstones, the modern memorial gardens with flat bronze plaques, and what we call the Potter's Field, the unmarked section where indigent burials took place throughout the decades. My routine was simple: arrive at 11 p.m., do a perimeter check, then patrol the grounds every 2 hours until 7 a.m. when the day crew arrived. In 8 years, the most excitement I'd had was chasing off teenagers trying to hold seances or catching someone stealing flowers from graves. Everything changed on a Tuesday night in September. I was doing my midnight round when I noticed something odd in Section C, the oldest part of the cemetery. There were people standing among the graves, at least a dozen figures scattered throughout the area. My first thought was that some kind of group had broken in, maybe for one of those paranormal investigation things that had become popular. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward them, already planning what I'd say. The cemetery closed at sunset, and trespassing was taken seriously by both the management and local police. But as I got closer, something felt wrong. They were too still. Too quiet. Even from a distance, I could see they weren't moving at all, not shifting their weight, not talking to each other, not even looking around. They were just standing there, scattered among the headstones like statues. "Hey!" I called out when I was about 50 yards away. "Cemetery's closed. You need to leave now." None of them responded. None of them even turned to look at me. I picked up my pace, the beam of my flashlight dancing across the uneven ground. As I got closer, I could make out more details. They were all wearing clothes that looked old-fashioned. Not costume old-fashioned, but genuinely aged, like clothing that had been stored away for decades. The fabrics looked faded and worn. When I was about 20 feet from the nearest figure, an elderly woman in a long dark dress, I stopped dead in my tracks. She was translucent. Not invisible, not ghostly in the Hollywood sense, but like she was made of morning mist given shape. I could see the headstone behind her right through her torso. Her face was turned downward, looking at a grave marker at her feet, and her expression was one of profound sadness. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only a few seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. My rational mind was screaming that this was impossible, that I was hallucinating or dreaming. But my eyes were reporting what they saw with crystal clarity. Slowly, as if sensing my presence, she lifted her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were filled with such deep sorrow that I actually staggered backward. It wasn't anger or malevolence, it was grief so profound it seemed to have weight, pressing down on everything around her. She looked at me for a long moment, then returned her gaze to the grave at her feet. I looked around at the other figures. They were all the same, translucent, motionless, staring down at graves with expressions of unbearable sadness. Men in old suits, women in outdated dresses, even a few children in clothing from what looked like the early 1900s. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. Not fading away dramatically, just absent. One moment they were there, the next moment I was alone among the headstones with only my racing heart and the distant sound of traffic to prove I was still in the real world. I spent the rest of that shift questioning my sanity. By morning, I had convinced myself it was some kind of stress-induced hallucination. I'd been working too many double shifts, drinking too much coffee, not getting enough sleep. There had to be a rational explanation. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. The next night, I brought a camera. If I was losing my mind, at least I'd have proof. If something genuinely supernatural was happening, well, I'd have proof of that too. They appeared again at exactly 12:47 a.m. This time there were more of them, maybe 20 or 25 figures scattered throughout Section C. I counted carefully, making mental notes of their positions and appearances. The elderly woman in the dark dress was there again, standing over the same grave. I raised my camera and took several photos, the flash illuminating the entire area in stark white light. In that brief moment of illumination, I could see them clearly, solid-looking, detailed, undeniably present. When I reviewed the photos later, they showed only empty cemetery grounds. This pattern continued for weeks. Every night, they would appear around the same time, always in Section C, always standing over specific graves. I started keeping detailed notes, how many appeared, where they stood, what they wore, how long they remained visible. I began researching the history of those particular graves, spending my days at the city library going through old newspapers and death records. What I found chilled me to the bone. Every single grave they stood over belonged to someone who had died under tragic circumstances. The elderly woman I'd first seen was standing over the grave of Margaret Whitman, who had died in 1923 when her house caught fire. She had been trapped on the second floor, unable to escape, while her 3 children perished in the rooms below. A man in a work shirt and suspenders stood nightly over the grave of Thomas McCready, a factory worker who had been killed in an industrial accident in 1934, leaving behind a pregnant wife and 2 young sons. A young woman in a 1940s dress watched over the grave of her own child, an infant who had died of pneumonia during the harsh winter of 1947. Every single one of them had died leaving behind unfinished business, unresolved grief, loved ones they couldn't protect or provide for. They weren't random spirits, they were souls bound to this place by the weight of their own sorrow and regret. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery. As I continued my research, I found records of similar sightings going back decades. Different groundskeepers, different night security guards, all reporting the same phenomenon. Figures standing over graves, always the same graves, always with expressions of profound sadness. But there was a pattern I hadn't noticed at first. Every few years, one of the night staff would quit suddenly, often citing personal reasons or health issues. When I dug deeper, I found that several of these former employees had disappeared. Not dramatically, not under mysterious circumstances that would attract police attention. They would simply stop showing up for work, stop paying rent, stop contacting family and friends. When people went looking for them, they would find empty apartments with belongings left behind, cars abandoned in parking lots, bank accounts untouched. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. That's when I noticed the figures were changing. At first, they had only appeared in Section C, standing over those specific tragic graves. But as the weeks passed, I began seeing them in other areas of the cemetery. They would stand along the paths I walked during my rounds, always at the edge of my vision, always watching. And they were no longer translucent. They were becoming more solid, more present, more real. I could see details I had missed before, the texture of their clothing, the lines on their faces, the way shadows fell across their forms. Sometimes, when the wind blew, I swear I could see their hair move. But the most unnerving change was in their behavior. They were no longer content to simply stand and grieve. They had begun to follow me. Not aggressively, not threateningly. They would appear at the beginning of my rounds and shadow my movements throughout the night, always maintaining the same distance, always watching with those grief-stricken eyes. I started to feel the weight of their accumulated sorrow like a physical presence. Every night spent in their company left me more exhausted, more depressed, more disconnected from the world of the living. I found myself thinking constantly about loss, about failure, about all the ways I had disappointed the people in my life. My wife started commenting on the changes in my behavior. I was withdrawing from family gatherings, snapping at my kids for minor infractions, spending hours staring out windows without speaking. Sleep became elusive, filled with dreams of standing in empty fields while faceless figures watched from the horizon. That's when I realized what was happening to me. They weren't just restless souls trapped by their own grief, they were collectors. They gathered the sorrow of the living, fed on it, used it to become more substantial, more real. Every night I spent in their presence, they grew stronger while I grew weaker. And I understood what had happened to my predecessors. They hadn't disappeared. They had been absorbed, transformed, made part of the eternal watch. Somewhere among those figures that appeared each night were the spirits of former groundskeepers, security guards, maintenance workers, anyone who had spent enough time in proximity to these restless souls. I was becoming one of them. The realization hit me 3 weeks ago when I caught my reflection in the office window during my rounds. For just a moment, in the dim light, I looked translucent. My face wore the same expression of profound sadness that I had seen on theirs. I was changing, becoming something that existed between the world of the living and the dead. A collector of grief, bound to this place by sorrow too heavy to bear alone. I tried to quit the next day, but my supervisor, Mr. Peterson, seemed strangely reluctant to accept my resignation. "You sure about this, Dave?" he asked, his eyes not quite meeting mine. 8 years is a long time to just walk away from. Maybe you just need a vacation, little time to clear your head. There was something in his voice, something that made me look at him more carefully. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his eyes held that same deep sadness I had come to know so well. "How long have you worked here, Mr. Peterson?" I asked. "Oh, long time now," he said vaguely. Long time." I pressed him for specifics, but he became evasive, changing the subject, making excuses to end our conversation. That afternoon, I went to the administrative offices and looked up his employment records. There was no record of anyone named Peterson ever working for the cemetery. That night, I didn't go to work. Instead, I sat in my car across the street and watched the grounds through binoculars. At 12:47 a.m., they appeared as usual, but this time there was a new figure among them. A man in a maintenance uniform, standing near the office building, looking around with confusion and growing horror. It was Peterson. Or rather, it was what Peterson had become. As I watched, the other figures turned their attention to him, and slowly, his expression changed from confusion to understanding to resignation. His shoulders sagged under the weight of accumulated grief, and he took his place among the eternal watchers. I should have driven away then. Should have kept driving until I reached another state, another life, anywhere these restless souls couldn't follow. But I couldn't. The pull was too strong, the need to return too overwhelming. I found myself walking through the cemetery gates, flashlight in hand, as if drawn by invisible threads. They were waiting for me. All of them, the original tragic souls, the absorbed groundskeepers and security guards, Peterson in his maintenance uniform, standing in a loose circle around my usual patrol route. Their faces turned toward me as I approached, and for the first time since this began, I saw something other than sadness in their expressions. I saw welcome. I saw recognition. I saw home. As I write this, I can feel the change completing itself. The world of the living grows dimmer with each passing hour, while the world of these restless souls becomes more vivid, more real. I understand now that this isn't a curse or a haunting in the traditional sense. It's a calling. These souls aren't trapped by their grief, they're guardians of it. Collectors and preservers of human sorrow, ensuring that no tragedy is forgotten, no loss goes unwitnessed. They stand eternal watch over the weight of the world's sadness, and they need living souls to help carry that burden. I can see them now, even in the daylight, standing patiently around my house, waiting for me to join them. My wife can't see them, but she can feel their presence. She keeps asking if I'm all right, if I need to see a doctor, if something's wrong. Everything's wrong, and everything's exactly as it should be. Tonight, I'll return to Riverside Cemetery for the last time as a living person. Tomorrow, someone else will be hired as the night groundskeeper. They'll think they're just taking care of an old cemetery, keeping watch over the peaceful dead. They'll learn the truth soon enough. The restless souls are always looking for new members to join their eternal vigil. And once they've chosen you, once you've felt the full weight of all that accumulated grief and sorrow, there's no going back to the shallow concerns of the living world. Some burdens are too heavy to carry alone. And some of us are meant to help.